All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to ARE Discussions, a bi-monthly webinar series held the first and third Tuesday of each month. ARE Discussions hosts experts to discuss issues facing California's agricultural and natural resource communities. I'm Tina Saitone. I'm a cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis, and I wanted to thank you for joining us live for ARE Discussions two-part series on topics surrounding the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This webinar series is being organized and hosted by cooperative extension specialists in agricultural and resource economics across 3 UC campuses. Brittany Goodrich and myself are specialists at UC Davis. Mehdi Namatami is a specialist at UC Riverside, and Ellen Bruno is a specialist at UC Berkeley. Just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is going to run for 1 hour. We'll have 20 minutes of guided question and answer with our esteemed guests, followed by guided Q&A at the end from the audience. So I want to remind you to all be submitting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen throughout the webinar. These webinars are being recorded, and this webinar and all of our previous webinars are available on our website, which is arediscussions.ucdavis.edu. So as I mentioned, today is our first in a two-part series focused on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. And today's discussion is going to focus on the role of water markets. To lead off today, Ellen Bruno is going to lead a discussion with David Sunding, who is a professor of the graduate school at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley, and is also president of the Brattle Group. Then Mehdi is going to be talking with Matthew Fienup. Dr. Fienup is an executive director at the Center for Economic Research and Forecasting at California Lutheran University. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ellen and David.
Thank you. And thank you, David, for being here today to discuss some of your work. We specifically want to talk about a study that you did on the economic impacts of pumping restrictions under SGMA. So could you just tell us a little bit about this blueprint study that you did, and what question you tried to answer, and sort of what are some of the scenarios that, that you were modeling in that research?
Yeah, for sure. Could I share my screen?
Yep, you should be good to go.
There, how's that?
If you'll just pop it into full screen mode,
All right.
see the PowerPoint, yeah. Perfect.
Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, good. Yeah, thanks, Ellen and Tina and Mehdi. Good to see all of you, even if we're not together. We're here virtually. So let me talk first of all about what the blueprint is. The blueprint is a grassroots effort in the San Joaquin Valley to look at future scenarios for water availability and water infrastructure and water institutions like markets, to try to cope with what I think a lot of people see is coming in a sense of less ground and surface water available to the communities. So how can those reductions be implemented in a way that's not economically ruinous for the valley? And I mean, impacts to not just farmers, but really broad-based community impacts to farm workers and people who are involved in agricultural service industries and the broader economy. So the blueprint research that I'm going to be talking about was funded by a collection of farm interests, individual farming companies, some water districts participated, and very heavy participation from a number of cities and some farm worker interests as well. So again, pretty broad-based coalition interested in these issues. And just in terms of what we looked at in the study, and I wanted to mention something at the outset that I'll bring up a couple of times. What I'm going to talk about is phase 1 of the work. So the study is very much still underway, and we'll talk about phase 2. But in terms of phase 1, the point is to look at economic implications to the valley and beyond of anticipated reductions in ground and surface water availability. And the reductions in groundwater availability are driven by sigma, and I'll talk about that quite a bit. But I do want to note that the impacts that I'll be talking about are also based on anticipated reductions in surface water deliveries. We're very much in a point right now with Sigma where we're looking at accounting, and there's no like completely totally adopted set of overdraft estimates out there. So, you know, there were a number of assumptions that I made going into the study about reductions in groundwater availability from Sigma. Roughly what I did was I took estimates that were previously done by PPIC. In a report that they put out on water futures in the valley. That report came out in February 2019. But I did take a little bit different view of what were the most accurate estimates. They looked at groundwater overdraft over a 30-year period going back to the late 1980s. And I think the first half of that 30-year period is not very reflective of current conditions. So I took just the second half of their 30-year period. I used data from 2003 to 2017, thinking that, in my view, that was the best estimate of what Sigma might mean. And then with respect to surface water reductions, basically we looked at the full range of measures that are incorporated in the governor's water resilience portfolio that got released in January 2020. And that includes elements such as full implementation of the San Joaquin River Restoration Plan, a return to the 2008-2009 BIOPS, or biological opinion, some climate-induced sea level rise, and implementation of state board staff recommendations for phase 1 and 2 of the Bay Delta Plan. So again, those were all roughly consistent with the assumptions that went into the governor's water resilience portfolio. So that kind of a long-winded answer to a straightforward question, which is what is the study about and what did we look at? But this is the assumptions that went into the study.
Great, thank you, Dave. From my reading of your study, I mean, it's clear that a big focus of it is how Sigma is impacting disadvantaged communities specifically. Mm-hmm. So would you mind explaining sort of what defines a disadvantaged community, first of all, in the study, and what you find about how Sigma and water reductions in water availability generally impact that group differently?
Sure. So the definitions of a disadvantaged community were taken from a new planning tool that the state has developed called Cal EnviroScreen. SB 535, which was passed a few years ago, directed state agencies to look at environmental regulations through an environmental justice lens. And, you know, the reasons for that, I think, are well known. So the state has undertaken definitions of what are disadvantaged communities for the purpose of looking at environmental justice impacts. And there are different definitions that the state uses for different census tracts. But roughly what it says is that a community is considered economically disadvantaged if median household income is at 80% of the statewide average, right? So generally low income. And I should add that probably, you know, it's no surprise to any of you, many of the poorest communities in California are in the San Joaquin Valley. There are some communities, some census tracts in the San Joaquin Valley where unbelievably, over 75% of households are below the state poverty line. I mean, think about that. That's really kind of a remarkable thing. Those tend to be communities concentrated on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. You know, the reasons for that, I think, are well known, but it's striking between LA County and the San Joaquin Valley. That's most of the communities that are classified as economically disadvantaged in the state.
So tell us, Dave, a little bit about, you know, the results that you found in phase one, just early and to disadvantage.
Sure. Sorry, I got barking dogs. So first of all, with respect to water supply impacts, let's start there, and I'll kind of break that apart from the economic impacts. SGMA implementation, and again, these are the numbers from the PPIC study, just the most recent part of their 30-year benchmark period. That will reduce average consumptive use by farmers in the San Joaquin Valley by about 2.4 million acre feet on average. And that's, again, across wet and dry years, just in an average year, 2.4 million acre feet. Now, importantly, one thing that we spent a lot of time and effort on was identifying these so-called wide areas in the valley. And probably a number of you are familiar with that terminology, but a wide area is an area where there's agricultural water use going on, so it's planted, but there's not any connection to a surface water delivery system. So it's an area that's 100% reliant on groundwater. So using land cover information from DWR coupled with administrative boundaries of water districts and a ton of ground truthing with individual water users, where there are all kinds of trades and water connections that don't show up on administrative boundary maps. You know, for example, in the area of the Cahuilla River, in the San Joaquin Valley, there are a lot of farmers that have surface water rights where they're just taking water out on an individual basis, so they're not in an organized water district. And unless you do the ground truthing, you would miss that. So we came up with a number of 820,000 acres that are only where there's only groundwater available. And the general thought, and I agree with it, is those are the areas that have the greatest potential for economic dislocation as a result of SGMA, because there's literally no physical way to get any other water in there. So water trading would have to be, you know, limited to some kind of groundwater transfers that don't happen right now, but could in the future. Now, on top of that, we looked at surface water reductions of 838,000 acre feet on average. And that's as a result of that list of measures that I went through before. So you add these two things together, 2.4 million reduced groundwater availability, 800,000 roughly reduced surface water availability, that's over 3 million acre feet, which is roughly just under 20% of all the water that's used by agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. Okay, so right there, before we do any fancy economic modeling or figure out how that loss is going to be distributed among users, think about that. A fifth of all the water that's currently used in San Joaquin Valley agriculture could go away as a result of SGMA plus, I think, really easily anticipated surface water reductions. So you want to know, like, why did the Blueprint Group form? Why are people in the Valley worried about this issue? That's your answer right there. I mean, this is really kind of unprecedented in terms of the magnitude of the change that's under consideration. So there is uncertainty, right? I want to acknowledge that. We don't know exactly about the SGMA accounting. We don't know exactly what future surface water restrictions are going to get put in place later on. But there's every reason that these kind of changes should get your attention. So then just, I'm probably going on too long, but just really briefly, some of the findings that we get. This is without water markets. So this is under current institutions, trades that are already happening, but no additional trades of surface water and no groundwater markets. So analytically, this is a useful scenario to look at if you want to try to quantify the benefits from water marketing. You've got to have a benchmark with no trading. So this is the no trading benchmark. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. This is what could happen without a change in institutions. So again, using this 2014 very detailed land cover information from DWR, which was, by the way, the same land use information that PPIC used in their study, what we come up with is just under 1 million acres of fallowing in the San Joaquin Valley from these ground and surface water reductions. Lost crop revenues of 7 billion, just over 7 billion. Lost operating income, so that's net income to farmers, of just under 2 billion, and that's per year. These are in average years, so it's going to be more in a dry year, less in a wet year. But on average, just under $2 billion, and statewide impacts of about 3.3 billion in lost operating income across all kinds of businesses, farming and outside, annually. And just really briefly, the labor market impacts are something that we highlighted in our work. Direct farm job losses, we're calculating about 42,000 direct farm job losses in the San Joaquin Valley. And that translates to about 1.1 billion in lost employee income in an average year. So again, it's going to be more in dry years, less in wet years, but on average, about 1.1 billion. Now, total job losses, so this is accounting for economic linkages between agriculture and the rest of the economy. We're getting about 65,000 lost jobs in the San Joaquin Valley and about 85,000 statewide, for a loss of 1.7 billion in employee income in the San Joaquin Valley and just over 2 billion in employee income statewide. And here, we were able to map out using information from the census, from the American Community Survey. We were able to map out the likely locations of the lost jobs. So once we figured out what sector they were in, then we could distribute them to individual census tracts. And not surprisingly, the location of the job losses is concentrated in the southern half of the San Joaquin Valley, where the water supply disruptions will be the greatest and the percentage of farm workers in the overall labor force tends to be greatest. So as you get to a more disaggregated level, you've got to take the results with more and more of a grain of salt. But I think directionally, this is probably a pretty accurate picture of where the job losses would occur. So again, Ellen, I apologize, very long-winded answer to a good question.
No, thank you, thank you. So can you explain how this study informs discussions about groundwater markets? You alluded to how these results are without any trade. So could you clarify how trading might affect your results?
Yeah, for sure. So of course, what trading will do is allocate the need to conserve water to the users who are best able to bear it. So the ones growing the lowest value crops in the most marginal locations, producing the least profits, that's where the cutbacks tend to get located under a water market. So we haven't calculated that part yet. That's coming in phase 2. But comparing phase 1 and phase 2 outcomes will give us a sense of how beneficial water markets are. And I should say, we'll also look at some additional infrastructure mainly to facilitate groundwater banking and water trading. And just a couple of things that I would note there. Groundwater banking, so taking flood flows in wet years and putting it underground in the San Joaquin Valley, that's distinct from water trading, but it's got great potential, I believe, to minimize some of these impacts. Believe it or not, there's still flows that are unclaimed or rights that aren't utilized right now because there's no capacity to take the water. So some investments in expanding Delta offtake capacity in certain areas could result in more groundwater banking and help to offset these impacts. The other thing I'd mention is that there's some additional infrastructure that people have talked about for years that may actually facilitate more water trading. And in particular, we have pretty good conveyance facilities north to south. Right, both the Frank Kern and then the San Luis Delta Mendota and California aqueducts all have pretty good capacity to move water north to south. What we're missing is capacity to move water east to west. So there are several places, 3 that we've identified, where some strategic investments in either pipelines or canals to move water from the east side of the valley to the west side could greatly improve the scope of water trading and, again, help to alleviate some of these negative impacts that we've identified in the study.
Great. So I just want to squeeze in one final question before I pass it off to Mehdi and Matt here. One concern that I've heard from different folks that I've talked to relates to protecting community drinking water, like these domestic supply wells, and concerns about trade harming those community drinking water supplies. And so many folks are worried that the market, groundwater trading might not directly benefit them, but has a lot of potential to harm them. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to this a little bit in relation to your study and sort of why those communities should care about what we're talking about here.
Yeah, for sure. I think those concerns are real. And I think there are other concerns about changing patterns of, it's not the case that an aquifer is just a simple bathtub. We would love for that to be true, but it's not the case. And when you put in a water market in a groundwater basin, what you're doing essentially is changing the pattern of pumping. And that means more pumping in some areas, less pumping in other areas. Well, in the areas where there might be more pumping, the elevation of the groundwater can drop, and that can result in the kinds of problems that Ellen was talking about. There could be municipal wells or domestic wells that become, either they run dry, which is an extreme case, or you can have some quality impacts where there are some contaminants or impurities that run into the, into the wells. So those are things you want to prevent. But there are also changes in groundwater elevation that occur when the total amount of pumping is increased. And that can also cause an external impact on everyone who's pumping around the area, where there's increased pumping. So those things are both very real. And I'll tell you, I've worked on groundwater trading for 20 years. I've worked in the Chino Basin, I've worked in Central Basin, West Coast Basin, Upper San Gabriel, worked on the Monterey Peninsula and a number of water basins there. Groundwater trading is extremely interesting, but it's also complicated. And, hopefully we're going to hear some positive stories about the Fox Valley, about Ventura County. But in the areas that I've worked in, groundwater trading, the reality of it, and I don't mean to be a bummer, but the reality of it, where it's been tried, has been a lot less than advertised. And it's just turned out to be more complicated than people imagined. And again, the experience I would draw on would be, just the areas that I mentioned where there are established groundwater markets with very, very small volumes of trading. Now, I hope that's going to change with Sigma. I really do, because as an economist, I believe that groundwater trading can have some great beneficial effects, but it's complicated and we'll have to see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Dave. There'll be more questions for you at the end when we open it up to the audience, but for now, I'll pass it off to Mehdi.
Thank you, Dave and Ellen, for the great discussion. Take us to the second part of the webinar to discuss with Matthew on the efforts that the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency is doing to implement groundwater markets in response to Sigma. Thank you, Matthew, being with us today. Can you please tell us a little bit about the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency, the parties involved in developing the groundwater markets?
Sure. Yeah, hey, Mehdi, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the exciting work that's happening in Fox Canyon. I'll start just by echoing what David said. This is really hard and really complex, harder than we ever imagined. And so it's exciting to report on some of those early results. So Fox, just in terms of quick background, Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency is a special act district created by the California legislature. And it was created in order to address seawater intrusion into coastal aquifers in Ventura County that was evident a long time ago, but acted upon in the early 1980s. As you look at the map there in the bottom right-hand corner, what's important to realize is the little gray area in the bottom right corner of the map is actually Los Angeles County. So we're just over the LA County border to the west. And so Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency has jurisdiction over 55,000 acres of prime agricultural land. What's interesting there is that this is some of the most valuable agricultural land you will find anywhere. So in the coastal aquifers, the most coastal aquifers, the ones right up against the ocean, where the water market is currently active, there's prime berry ground that routinely sells for $90,000 to $100,000 an acre. And that represents just the returns on an acre of ground. This is not land that's going to be developed. We have extremely strict urban growth restrictions. There's no development pressure there. That's just the rent on the ground. So very valuable agricultural land, representing over $2 billion in agricultural production in this county. So the Special Act District was created in the 80s. In 1987, Fox Canyon GMA started requiring metering of all agricultural wells within their jurisdiction. And they actually did an estimation of safe yield and quantified allocations beginning in the early 1990s. So we have had allocations and metering since at least 1990. Because it's a special act district, Fox Canyon GMA was the Sigma designated groundwater sustainability agency. So automatically, so there was no process of GSA formation. The GMA just changed hats, it became a GSA. That was helpful for us because we do have 2 critically overdrafted basins. There's actually 3 DWR designated basins, 2 of which are critically overdrafted. And so we have obviously had to submit the GSP in January 2020. And we are anticipating 40 to 50% reduction in total pumping across the basins. And from very early on, Fox Canyon has sought to implement a water market, as a groundwater market, as part of their GSP. One other quick detail that it's maybe worth mentioning about Fox Canyon is this is a heavily groundwater dependent area. So we are about 89% groundwater within the agency boundary in an average rainfall year, and we're 100% groundwater in a dry year. There is a river that, the Santa Clara River, an intermittent river that flows, there are storm flows along the northern boundary of Fox Canyon GMA, and there is diversion into the Oxnard forebay to recharge groundwater basins. In terms of the water market, one other important piece of this is the water market group. So early in the Sigma process, Fox Canyon had tried to leverage stakeholder involvement by actually creating a formal group, giving it a charter. And this was the Water Market Group. It included more than 50 members, mostly agricultural pumpers, but also municipal and environmental water users. It was essential to the GMA that it represent all three user groups. I was named the chair of that. In fact, because I had already been talking with growers for about 2 years about water markets, and growers, even before SGMA dropped, had actually started to build consensus around ideas regarding water trading and what that might look like in Fox Canyon. And so the stakeholder group was formally built to include municipal and environmental water use in that discussion. We met for 7 months, every other week, surveyed, adjudicated basins. We invited people running water markets in the Western United States and around the globe to come present to us. And in that, one of those presentations, we got the very, very excellent warning that this is harder than you ever imagined. Proceed cautiously and modestly. And we heeded that advice. And at the end of 7 months, remarkably, even though it was at times very contentious early on, putting farmers and environmentalists and farmers and cities in the same room together, at the end of 7 months, the group unanimously approved a set of recommendations around the structure and operational mechanisms for a water market. And one of those, that proposal is now the Fox Canyon water market pilot.
Thanks, Matthew. And as you and Dave mentioned, this is a complex issue. What are some of the enabling conditions that Fox Canyon has, the groundwater market in Fox Canyon benefited from?
Yeah, thanks. So one thing I want to direct people to, I'll just mention some of the ones that I think are the most noteworthy, but I want to direct people to the case study that we wrote. This is available at groundwaterresourcehub.org. And this is the work product of my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy, who are really critical partners on this initiative. Sarah Hurd, E.J. Remsen, and we wrote this case study, and we talk in detail about a number of enabling conditions. The one that I guess just some practical ones. Obviously, you have to have water scarcity. One of the challenges of implementing a water market pilot under SGMA is that we don't necessarily in Ventura County have water scarcity, acute water scarcity today. In fact, pumping allocations are pretty generous right now. We know that in 20 years, we could be looking at as much as a 50% reduction. Water will be extremely scarce. And so the idea is to try and build a market which in the early days may have lower trading volumes, less need to trade, knowing that we want to refine this tool and make sure that it works so that it's available and functioning when it's most needed in 20 years at the end of the ramp down. Obviously, you need fixed allocations, a clearly defined unit of trade. That wasn't so hard for Fox Canyon because we already had a system of allocation going back a number of decades. We also believe you need a credible monitoring regime. You can't buy and sell what you don't measure. And we have a unique approach to that, which I hope to touch on later in this presentation. We actually use universal telemetric monitoring of groundwater extraction. So we have third-party hardware reading extraction and aggregating pumping data. But the one I really want to focus on is I think a critical enabling condition is agricultural stakeholder support. So this only worked in Fox Canyon because the idea actually originated among growers, and growers had been, and this started as just small discussions that myself and a 5th generation farmer in Ventura County initiated with small groups of growers, just going, having lunch, talking about trading, what it would look like, what the goals and concerns were among agricultural water users. And then the agricultural community built consensus around a set of ideas. And then those ideas became the framework at the start of the water market group's work. And then it was urban and environmental water users who then refined those ideas, and changed those. But but because it initiated among growers, we had very, very strong buy-in from agricultural stakeholders, and we've had excellent participation. So the pilot that's currently underway is just in one of the three basins, the largest of the three. But we have had 83% of eligible participants enrolled in the market this last year, the water year we just wrapped up. 47% of agricultural water users, 40% of participants actually participated in submitting bids and offers for water. In one case, we helped one operation avoid $345,000 in surcharges by paying someone else not to pump. And so we're already seeing real benefits for growers. And so I think agricultural stakeholder support was critical. You know, if this had started, we actually in the water market group had other groups come in and say, oh, this is going to be easy. You know, we operate water markets in Australia, we operate markets somewhere else. Just give us a couple rules, we'll build you a market, you'll be trading water tomorrow. You know, again, we also got warnings saying, no, this is extremely difficult, proceed cautiously. And because it was not a top-down approach, it was the growers talking about what was important, what their concerns were. That stakeholder support really built a strong foundation for the project that's currently underway.
Thanks, Matthew. And could you please elaborate a little bit more on how groundwater allocated in the Fox Canyon setup, and how did you guys arrive at that allocation?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we've had fixed allocations for a long time. And so from the early 1990s through 2014, we had some form of fixed allocation based on historical pumping. So there was a historical base period that was used to establish those allocations. They were reduced 25% in the earliest days of Fox Canyon. And so along the way, there were some experiments with alternate forms of allocation. You know, we had something called conservation credits at one time, but more or less from the 90s to 2014, it was mostly a system of fixed allocations based on that historical base period. We passed an emergency drought ordinance in 2014 that changed that significantly. And we actually moved to something locally called the IAI, the Irrigation Allowance Index. So this is an efficiency-based allocation based on ETO zone, and we have three of them based on precipitation, whether it's low, average, or high. And based on the crops that you actually grow, you're given an efficient allocation, and you're allowed to pump up to that efficient amount. Those efficiency allocations were reduced, I believe, by 10% under the emergency drought ordinance. But what was interesting there is that from 2014 to 2020, at the very same time we're trying to implement a water market, we moved away from a fixed allocation. And under the IAI in Ventura County, you actually didn't know what your water, what your allowed pumping was until the end of the water year. After we'd seen, well, how much water fell, how many acres of various crops did you actually grow? Did you do a 30-day cilantro rotation between, you know, your two celery rotations, that sort of thing? And so it actually wasn't very conducive to a water market. And so I'll talk about how we address that. That has changed. So as of October 1st, 2020, a new ordinance was passed, which gives, this is now what we're calling the permanent allocation, implemented under SGMA, and that's a fixed allocation, again, based on a 10-year historical base period, and it's the 10 years that precede the passage of SGMA. And so we are now back, as of this year, back on fixed allocations, and the expectation is those will be ramped down over the next 20 years. Now, as I mentioned, the IAI allocation was not conducive to a market, so we actually did have what was called a market allocation. So participants who enrolled in the market, and again, we've had robust participation. Participants, when they signed a participation agreement, actually moved off of the IAI onto a fixed market allocation. And that has been, again, based on a historical base period.
Perfect, thank you. And what type of protections do you have in place for, you know, drinking water wells, ecosystem sensitive areas?
Yeah, so a big one in Ventura County is, I'll talk about some special management areas where there are already third-party impacts and environmental impacts of overpumping. And so we also have groundwater dependent ecosystems There aren't yet rules to address those. We actually don't have issues of, we don't have urban or municipal supply issues because everyone, all urban water users in the GMA actually have municipal water service from one of the 4 cities. And so we don't worry as much about that aspect of it. But I believe some of the tools that we're implementing can be applied to a number of different vulnerable groups. And so what we have in Fox Canyon is we have designation of 2 special management areas. So the blue hatched area here is the area of seawater intrusion, where saltwater, because of overpumping and a negative gradient, water is being drawn off of the ocean into underground aquifers. The purple area here is actually a pumping trough, right, where water levels. That's what's causing the negative gradient off of the ocean. And then you have the orange area to the northwest of those 2 areas, which is a relatively healthier part of the basin. And so we actually have rules regarding how water can be traded between these various special management areas. And so the primary rule is that trading cannot result in an increase in total pumping in either of those special management areas. That's to say, we can't transfer additional pumping into the seawater intrusion area because that would increase seawater intrusion. You cannot increase total pumping in the pumping trough because that would accelerate the decline of water levels. And in fact, we want to have market incentives that will move pumping inland to relatively healthier parts of the basin. And so what you see here is the arrows represent people within a management area can trade water with each other, and then they can sell their pumping outside of the special management area. Same thing in the seawater intrusion area. They can trade with each other, and they can sell their pumping to someone outside of the special management areas. And so I don't remember the number exactly off the top of my head, but something like 25% of all of the transfers of allocation in the last water year were actually transfers out of the pumping trough into the forebay basin. So we have shown that market incentives can move pumping and reduce pumping in vulnerable areas. I know that the Nature Conservancy, again, who's a critical partner, brought a tremendous amount of funding for AMI hardware telemetry and is paying enrollment fees for water market participants, is doing a number of excellent things for the pilot. They have concern about groundwater dependent ecosystems along the Santa Clara River. So a later version of this pilot, we hope to actually build that in as a management area and then have pumping restrictions, directional restrictions, which would support environmental goals for the region.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about the market goals, objectives, and trading rules for the pilot water market developed by the Fox Canyon?
Yeah, so I guess I want to answer the question sort of in this way, just to talk about some of the unique features and the problems that they address. And so some of the big concerns that water users had, first of all, was that agricultural water users feared that they would not, first of all, that people would cheat the system, right? And so one of the things that we adopted was universal telemetry. So we're using, we actually have 3 different vendors that provide hardware, but Ranch Systems, the initial phase of the Fox Canyon water market pilot was simply an AMI demonstration program where we use cellular telemetry to read groundwater extraction. We built a central data portal where all pumping data is aggregated. And so the regulator gets they get monthly pumping totals. Agricultural water users can see real-time pumping data. And then of course the exchange administrator gets to see water available for trade and make sure that no one's pumping into surcharge territory. And so this and other elements of the market were designed with the primary goal of creating a fair marketplace and to reduce market power. A lot of agricultural water users were concerned, hey, if we do this thing, it's just going to be the giant operators, the big packer shippers, the multinational agribusinesses. They're going to extract all the gain from trade. If I'm a 5th generation farmer with smaller acreage, there's just no way I'm going to benefit from trade. In fact, they may even be able to exclude me from participation altogether. So one of the outgrowths of that was not just telemetric monitoring. It was also that the market is anonymous, that people don't know who the counterparty is. They can't say, I refuse to sell water to that person because they're a competitor. That necessitated the use of a central exchange administrator. So I play that role. California Lutheran University is the exchange administrator. And then we also use algorithmic matching. One of the things farmers were worried about was strategic bidding. And again, they wanted to make sure that the gain from trade was split evenly between the counterparties. So we use algorithmic matching. Another goal was to start simple. We heeded the warning that this was complex. Every time we turned over a rock, we would discover some unintended consequence we never thought of. And so we did start simple, and we've built an adaptive approach with a series of pilots that allow us to test rules and then modify the market as needed on a regular basis. And so currently only agricultural water users are allowed in the market. We are getting close to very, very close to allowing urban water users as well. The goal is eventually to allow anyone to be a participant, whether they're a landowner or not, whether they're a city or farmer. Environmental water users could buy water for nature, for example, without owning land in the basin. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the special management areas, one of the primary goals was to positively impact the distribution of water quality. One last concern I just want to mention quickly is there was also concern, especially because of the very, very strict land use regulations that we have in Ventura County, the urban containment policies. There was significant concern that groundwater trading might actually induce land use change that would not happen absent groundwater trading. And in fact, that it might cause urbanization and the loss of agricultural lands. And so in order to make trading neutral with respect to land use changes, currently we only allow temporary transfers. There are not, there's a concern that we might have dried out some farms, sold all of the allocation off a farm and it couldn't function as a farm. And that might lead to land use change. And so those are some of the goals and then the resulting decisions we made about structure and operational mechanisms to address those goals and concerns.
Thanks, Matthew. In interest of time and to allow questions from the audience, can you really quickly tell us for some of the takeaways for other GSAs? And then
you bet. Yeah. So two things I want to mention is, number one, GSAs that think that. So first of all, I want to echo what David said. This is really, really hard, and so you need to approach this humbly. You need to start simply, and then have an adaptive approach. Do the simplest thing first. Learn as you go, and then build complexity over time. So it has to start with the assumption that this is really, really complex. So that's number one. And then I guess the other thing I would add is that GSAs really should start with the water market in mind early in the process of GSP development. So I've seen some GSAs that are writing GSPs where there's a placeholder. Yeah, some way down the road, we will build a market, right? Again, if you understand how complex this is, that needs to be part of the forward planning. And that in fact, it is possible that elements of a GSP could exclude, for example, the allocation system, the monitoring program. Those things could actually exclude the possibility of a market. So if you want to do a market, that needs to be part of the GSP planning process from the beginning. It can't be an afterthought that's addressed later. And at the same time, I think a great lesson is that in Fox Canyon, it is definitely the case that developing the water market at the same time we were writing the GSP, I think produced a better GSP. That the things that water markets need, the predicates for a water market, make for better management, right? And so I actually think that it produced a better product in Fox Canyon.
No, thanks, Matthew. I turn it to Brittany for leading a quick Q&A with the audience.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, guys. So the first question is going to be for Dave. So in your study, could you share how farmer adaptability was taken into account? So things like crop switching, changing rotations, or switching irrigation technology?
Sure. So remember that with Sigma, to meet the water balance requirements of not having an overdraft, that entails a reduction in consumptive use. So irrigation technologies are not going to help, because what they do is they reduce the differential between applied water and consumptive use. They don't reduce consumptive use itself generally. So irrigation technologies won't help. In terms of economic factors like crop switching or prioritization of crops, we developed a ranking of crops based on net income and took out the crops that had the lowest levels of net income as being kind of representative of what farmers would do if they were trying to manage profits. So there is some of that incorporated in the model. Now, in other areas, we took just proportional reductions in all crops, particularly in the wide areas. If there's no water market in place, so no ability to trade, and there's no surface water facilities available, then an 80% reduction in water that can be used by a farm means crops go down by 80%. So it's more or less straight proportional. But again, this is all assuming that there's no change in institutions, just using current patterns of water trading. The next step in the research is going to be layer in the groundwater markets.
Got it. Thank you. So the next question, we'll start off with Matthew, because this one is specific for him, but I think maybe Dave could answer more generally after Matthew. But so a similar market in Diamond Valley, Nevada has run into legal challenges with senior water rights holders, claiming the water market violates their prior appropriation rights. Do you see this as a potential problem in Ventura County? So Matthew, do you have any thoughts on that? I think you're muted.
Thank you. It's not fair to compare Nevada water rights and California water rights because they're just such different regimes. But we definitely were concerned. You study environmental markets. One of the things that undermines markets is regulatory threat. That allocations might change later on, something like that. And so one of the things that we did in the water market group is we first surveyed all of the adjudicated basins. So we actually commissioned a report on background information and trading institutions in all of California's adjudicated basins. That's by Andrew Ayers. It's an excellent paper, and people can contact me if they'd like to get a copy of it. And then what we did is we sort of used those as mileposts, fence posts. The idea was let's produce a system for water trading that would be a very plausible stipulated judgment in an adjudication. And there was even discussion early on that after we've developed this thing and it has become taken on a permanent form, we can go to a court and actually get a court to stamp it and implement this as a stipulated judgment. And then that structure becomes cemented, right? That then it can't be undermined by legislation in the future. So that is something we were concerned about. Again, we addressed it by surveying adjudicated basins and then trying to sort of follow what we saw from those judgments issued in other basins.
Yeah. If I could add just a couple I was struck when Matthew was talking, some of the features that are built into the Fox Canyon market where you have basically trading can go one direction, but not the other. That's a common feature in other groundwater markets. And so, for example, to deal with concerns about groundwater pumping depleting rivers, depleting surface water. In Nebraska, for example, what the state has done is they created what they call a rapid response zone, where there's trading among farmers who use groundwater for center pivot systems, but a unit of pumping next to the river is treated differently than a unit of pumping further away. And they actually did something interesting. They established an exchange rate between those two zones, where 1 unit of pumping next to the river is worth 2 units of pumping further away. And in certain dry years where they're concerned about habitat, they can turn on these requirements to discourage pumping near the near the river. So there are clever ways to build in features like that. Maybe seawater intrusion, or, you did mention some ecosystem water needs in Ventura County. So there are ways to build this in that have been done.
And Dave, I'll just add that our sternest warning came from folks in Nebraska telling us how complex this was. And so we were intimidated. We considered exchange rates initially and said, oh my gosh, that's a layer of complexity we can't handle yet. And so we initially just have these directional restrictions. Yeah, but I agree, that would be an innovation that could add value creation in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys for that answer. So we'll try and get one more quick question in. We had a ton of questions, so we're not going to get to all of them. So I think this one probably goes to Dave, but I'm sure you both have thoughts on this. So what could these water markets do to protect drinking water that fees and incentives cannot? So the idea here is, this is all about market efficiency and maximizing profits, but then you also have the vulnerable populations in the San Joaquin Valley that depend on this for, they can't have their wells run dry.
Right.
So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. The way that's usually been handled in the past is not through financial incentives, but through kind of circuit breakers on markets. Whether the concern is about, say, community drinking water supplies or adverse impacts on farm worker populations. The way it's typically handled is there could be no more than X% of the water leaving a particular area that's, defined somehow on a map. And it's just to prevent these negative third-party effects, or what economists call externalities, from getting too big.
Yeah, and I would just add, again, we don't have the same issues, drinking water security. However, one of the biggest advocates in the water market group for this project and for the agricultural water users proposal was the city of Ventura. Ventura Water was a strong advocate for the growers' proposals, because they actually saw that that one of the solutions was to bring new supply online. And in Ventura County, the lowest hanging fruit is treating advanced treatment of wastewater. And they actually said, wait a minute, if we have another user that we can sell water to, some of these capital intensive projects actually start to pencil out for us. And we might actually engage in investment, create new water that we would not absent a water market. And so Dave talked about in the Central Valley, well, we need conveyance to move water east to west, right? And so water markets do have the potential to drive investment in those institutional changes that might not happen otherwise. And so some of those do have the potential to benefit even vulnerable groups in the valley.
Okay. So we're now past 11. So if you guys are willing and able to stay on for a few more minutes to answer a couple more questions, that's great, but we completely understand if you don't have time to stay on. So are you guys okay with staying on for a little bit longer?
Absolutely.
Sure.
All right, awesome.
This is the most fun thing I'll do all day. I'll just.
Oh, great. Okay, so I'm not sure who this one is for. I think you both can answer anything, in my opinion, but do water market effects account for institutional transaction costs? And how large in scope will the water markets be? So they're asking about whether they're irrigation districts or perhaps large aggregated markets in Australia. Do you anticipate size limitations as being a problem?
If I can comment on the particulars of Fox Canyon, David might be able to generalize from that, which I think could be valuable. So, again, we chose a very particular solution, right? Water markets are not going to look the same in every basin. But one of the things we were very concerned about were transaction costs, right? And in fact, one of the transaction costs in particular we're worried about was, well, how do willing buyers and sellers find each other, right? If these are just coffee shop trades, they meet down at the coffee shop for the morning coffees they attend, and and they negotiate, do you have water? What's a good price? First of all, it would exclude some people from participation. But then once you say, okay, well, everyone can participate and we want everyone to have equal opportunity to participate, the question becomes, well, now how do they find each other, right? And so what we adopted was this centralized exchange. There was one place to go buy and sell. And the other innovation that we implement is that all of the transfers are pre-cleared by the regulator. And so one transaction cost is finding buyers and sellers, negotiating a price, and then actually formalizing the contract. And what's unique in Fox Canyon is that once bids and offers are matched, that they are pre-approved, and so the transfer is instantaneous, right? The transfer simply gets reported to the regulator, but those were pre-approved. There's no question whether or not the transfer will be confirmed.
And I just echo the fact that the pre-approval is critical. One of the great things about a centralized water market, like Matthew's describing in Fox Canyon, is that it does minimize transaction costs. And that actually has the effect of making it more democratic in a way. Something that I found from earlier work that I did on surface water markets in the San Joaquin Valley was that the bigger farms that have full-time water managers, they tended to be the ones that participated the most in the market, because they had the people who could go out and find the deals. When we put a centralized market in place within Westlands Water District, which is one of the biggest districts anywhere, participation became more broad-based at that point. And so that's a real advantage of a centralized market. I just want to emphasize, though, the importance of regulatory pre-approval. One of the major reasons that there's not more water trading in California, which I think almost universally people think is a good idea, not totally universal, but a lot of people think would be a good idea, is the regulatory requirements get to be onerous and they're slow. And a lot of water market transactions have to happen quickly to be useful at all. So the really onerous, almost Byzantine system we have in California for approving water transfers, that is a real impediment to a more rational allocation.
Okay, so this one is for David originally, but we've had a couple that are similar to this. So I think Dave, we'll have you answer first, and then maybe Matthew follow up with specifics for Fox Canyon. But does your financial study also include the loss of farm equity as land is taken out of production? This would transfer to loss of tax revenue as well.
Yeah, so we did not, I didn't show a slide that shows the public finance impacts. We did calculate lost federal tax revenues and lost state and local tax revenues, which of course total into the hundreds of millions annually. We did not capitalize the net income loss into a change in farmland value, which would of course, imply some property tax losses. So that would be incremental to anything we've done, but the effect the questioners are describing is very real.
Okay. And Matthew, do you have any thoughts on how have you realized, or has this been realized in Fox Canyon? And also they ask about whether lending institutions recognize these changes in value. You're muted again.
So first of all, what's interesting is that the agricultural lenders in Ventura County have definitely gotten good at making sure they actually learn, okay, what is the allocation for this property? But in our discussions with them, they believe that the water market actually supports agricultural land values, at least in the short to medium term. And the reason for that is because if someone needs to finish a crop and needs a little bit more water, right, they actually have a place to go get it right now. and that I mentioned, right, we had one operator that was able to forego $350,000 in pumping surcharges to finish a crop at the end of the water year, and to buy that water at a small fraction of what the surcharges would have been. And I will say too, we obviously, a feature of the Fox Canyon water market that I think agricultural lenders appreciate is that we don't allow those permanent transfers, because they would be concerned about a property being dried out and not actually having access to water during the term of a loan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, why don't we do one last question, since we're 10 minutes, almost 10 minutes over. So we had this one come in. Do you think the generation of solar energy and wind energy, if they become really cheap in the future, expanding groundwater market concept will not overexploit the aquifer? I'm not sure that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not yeah, I'm not totally sure about the question. I do want to say though, one other feature of our study, the blueprint study that I want to highlight, is for local agencies, the prospect that, say without groundwater markets, our numbers right, and it turns out to be 1 million acres coming out of agricultural production. Well, maybe with water markets, you could bring that number down even by half, right? That would be huge, but even if you could do that, that's a huge land use change that the Valley has to deal with. And what becomes of that land is a very important question for local jurisdictions to deal with. Does that land just go fallow? And then you have all the attendant air quality and invasives concerns that can come with that. Does it become subdivisions? Does it become renewable energy? Does it become expanded wildlife habitat? So there are real interesting possibilities for what to do with all of that land. And so I think that's a question that local jurisdictions, namely cities and counties, are going to be very concerned with. And managing the process of several 100,000 up to 1 million acres coming out of farming in the Valley. Again, remember, that's about 1/5 of all the land that's under cultivation right now. That is a very big deal. And so while we're talking a lot about water in this discussion today, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's a very important land use overlay to these questions as well.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I believe Tina has some information about the next SGMA webinar. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, so thanks, Brittany, for facilitating the Q&A, and thanks to David and Matthew for joining us today. I wanted to make a quick plug for our next webinar. As I mentioned, we're going to do a 2-part series on SGMA. On November 17th, our second part will feature the potential for managed aquifer recharge. So I encourage you to visit our website and register and participate live, or watch the recording afterwards. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it.